I've been following our policy in Europe, uh, the Russian threat to American interests, Moscow's war in Ukraine, for 10 and a half years very closely. And I remember how unhappy and surprised the Kremlin was when Assad uh, violated the red line that Trump established about using weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons, on Syrian civilians. And Trump unleashed scores of tomahawks, which took out much of the Syrian Air Force. The Russians duly took note of that, and they were not happy. So they may overplay, they are likely to overplay their hands in any possible negotiation with Ukraine, which would persuade Trump that, yes, they're trying to take him for a fool, and he will not abide that.
Hello and welcome to Frontline. My name is Alex Dibble, Times Radio's Deputy Head of News. Today we are joined by Ambassador John E. Herbst, who was the US Ambassador to Ukraine formerly and is currently the Senior Director of the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. Ambassador Herbst, thank you very much for joining Frontline.
My pleasure, thank you.
We are speaking having received the results of the US election. I thought we could start by talking briefly about your thoughts on what this will mean over the next few weeks and months for US-Ukraine relations. A lot has been made during the campaign, mainly sort of surrounding Donald Trump and his comments on Ukraine over the last year or so. What are your thoughts on where things go from here as a result of the election?
The short answer is we don't know what his policy will be on Russia and Ukraine and Moscow's aggression in Ukraine, and the danger that Moscow poses to the United States and its allies. There is one group in his camp which is oblivious, it seems, to the fact that Putin regularly calls the United States its number one adversary, and clueless to the fact that if Putin were to win his war in Ukraine, then the United States would have to greatly ramp up defense expenditures, especially in the east of Europe. And we could find ourselves, in fact, in a war as Putin decides to test the willingness of NATO to defend its most vulnerable members on the East front. So there's one group that doesn't understand that. There's a second group, which I'd say represents some truly sound American statesmanship in the best tradition of John F. Kennedy and Ronald Reagan. People like Pompeo, the former Secretary of State, O'Brien, the former National Security Advisor. And not only would they continue support to Ukraine, but they would not suffer from the timidity of the Biden administration and give Ukraine more advanced weapons so they do better on the battlefield and allow them to strike into Russia against legitimate military and strategic targets. So which of those groups prove to have the ear of the president-elect is very important. And the first sign we will have, of course, will be when we hear who is going to be his Secretary of State, his Secretary of Defense, and his National Security Advisor. One thing we should expect is that Trump will move on what he said he would do, which is try to achieve a negotiated peace. Everything depends on what the terms of such a peace are. If that peace involves a well-armed Ukraine, if that peace involves a security guarantee of some form for Ukraine, to my mind, that would best be in NATO, but there are other ways to do that. Then that peace could be a stable one. Although, to be honest, I don't think Putin will go for a peace with such conditions. If that peace means that Ukraine must be, according to Russian demands, neutral, demilitarized, well, then such a peace will not last very long because Putin's aims go beyond the territory his armies currently control in Ukraine. That would be a peace of appeasement that would make Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan look like statesmanship. And we know how dreadful that withdrawal was. When you go through it the way I've just described it, it leaves at least me somewhat optimistic because Trump values being seen as a strong man. And if he were opt for the view of his naive advisors, and give Putin a victory in Ukraine, he would look like an extremely weak president and one of our worst foreign policy presidents. And I don't think he has any intention of becoming such a figure.
I wanted to ask you about a couple of things related to that. First, really, was comments from the Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky responding to the election result. He said he recalls his great meeting with President Trump in September when they discussed the victory plan. He went on to say that, "I appreciate President Trump's commitment to peace through strength as an approach in global affairs." He says this is exactly the principle that can practically bring just peace in Ukraine closer, and I'm hopeful that we will put it into action together. The thing that stuck out to me, I don't know if you think this is significant, is the phrase just peace. It can't be peace in Zelensky's mind. It has to be just peace. And if it's just peace rather than just peace, he won't want to agree to any negotiation himself, let alone what Vladimir Putin might want or not want.
Well, I think that's true. And I think that Ukraine is deeply dependent upon American military assistance. And so he may well find himself entering a negotiation process with uncertainty about some of the terms as understood by the Trump administration. I can't predict how Zelensky will react as this evolves, but such a position, in other words, where he enters negotiations not fully sure on these points, is not necessarily a bad one. The key is what becomes the terms and what he does when those terms become apparent. But the Russians, and I think probably mistakenly, are licking their chops at Trump's victory. They seem to think they can have their way with Trump in the White House. And I suspect that, again, we can't be certain. There are naive folks around Trump who don't understand how important these issues are. But I think that the Russians will be disappointed. I can tell you, I've been following our policy in Europe, the Russian threat to American interest, Moscow's war in Ukraine, for 10 and a half years very closely. And I remember how unhappy and surprised the Kremlin was when Assad violated the red line that Trump established about using weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons, on Syrian civilians. And Trump unleashed scores of Tomahawks, which took out much of the Syrian Air Force. The Russians duly took note of that, and they were not happy. So they may overplay, they are likely to overplay their hands in any possible negotiation with Ukraine, which would persuade Trump that, yes, they're trying to take him for a fool, and he will not abide that.
It's interesting. You mentioned a few minutes ago that you had reason to be optimistic, and you've just said that you think the Russians might end up being disappointed. I think is what you just said. In the last year, the general discussion around Donald Trump was that a second Trump presidency would end up being very bad for Ukraine through lack of financial support or forcing through negotiations that wouldn't be in Ukraine's interest. I mean, just today, we've had a Ukrainian MP speaking to Times Radio, Alexei Goncharenko, who said that Trump brings, whilst higher risks, greater possibilities. He referred to comments in Trump's speech about his plans to drill, and that if the global oil price dropped as a result of that, that could be devastating for the Russian economy, which is funding the war effort. So do you think Trump's second term has been portrayed in an accurate light in the lead up? Is it as black and white as with regard to Ukraine as everybody seems to have suggested?
I think that there have been two deeply opposed parties pushing the line you just described. On the one hand, the Democrats and the mainstream media in the United States, who often work in tandem, have been painting Trump as a monster and claiming that whatever good things happened in his first term was the result of sound advisors whom he will not be choosing in a second term. You've heard that repeatedly from that quarter. And you've heard, you might say, a parallel analysis coming from the loudest supporters of, we might say, MAGA politics. I'm thinking about people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, Matt Gaetz, and others, but not a large number. And of course, there are enablers in the media, Tucker Carlson, right, who claim that, well, Trump didn't really know Washington in his first term, so he relied on Republican insiders. Now that he knows Washington, he's going to be taking true MAGA types. And these are the naive people who have no clue about how dangerous Putin is to the United States. And so together they have presented this view from very different political, ideological angles. But again, if that were true, then you wouldn't expect Mike Pompeo to have clear access to Trump and influence with Trump. You wouldn't expect Robert O'Brien to be a key figure, to have been a key figure on Trump's foreign policy campaign. You know, in the campaign, he was in charge of foreign policy. And we know there are others who are being considered, at least according to media rumors, for cabinet level positions on national security. Tom Cotton, Bill Hagerty, who are sound, understanding the danger of Russia and China and Iran and North Korea working together, and to the detriment of the United States, including in Ukraine.
So is that another way of saying that perhaps there is more to it, this second presidency, than has been portrayed, you think?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So again, we can't be sure how Trump will come down on these issues. But we know that there are people around him who are quite sound. We know that ultimately the aid package passed in April because Trump gave the okay to Speaker Johnson. We know that as that was happening, Trump said that Ukraine's survival is important to the United States. Those are all things on which to build a sound policy. In fact, a sounder policy than we had under Biden. Honcharенko is right regarding Trump has always been good on increasing American oil and gas production, something the Democrats have hindered. We know that Trump is good on Nord Stream 2, while Biden was willing to coddle Schultz and go along with Nord Stream 2 until the big invasion came. In fact, Biden continues to coddle Schultz because our Nord Stream 2 sanctions end this year. And Schultz asked Biden to block a renewal in the Congress, and Biden's been doing that, much to his shame. That won't happen under Trump. That's a good thing.
You touched on this a moment ago, but I thought we might be able to flesh it out a little bit more. You referred back to the withdrawal of US troops in Afghanistan and how that was the consequences of that for Afghanistan, but also how it, I suppose, tainted Joe Biden's reputation. How conscious do you think Donald Trump is that a failure in foreign policy can end up defining a US president, and therefore how keen will he be to avoid that in not making an error that would play into the hands of a US and indeed a Western enemy?
No one ever accused Trump of being a person deeply interested in history or deeply interested in getting to the bottom of complex issues through close study. He's an intuitive politician who did very well in his first term on many domestic issues and did not do badly on foreign policy, national security issues, even when things he said were not helpful. So I'm not sure he's given this much thought. You can be certain that people around him have. And you can be certain that if, say, the naive advisors had the ear at the beginning of his term and begin to have influence, maybe lead to a cutting off of, not just a cutting off of American aid or sharp diminution of American aid, but pushing for terms which are ultimately going to lead to the surrender of Ukraine to Russia. This will create a vast media controversy, and even sound Republicans in the Senate will be expressing concern, and perhaps even publicly. And that fuss, I suspect, would have an impact on the president, a positive impact. And he might begin to see the dangers of those policies for his own reputation. He considers himself a very strong and able man. And given his victory after everything that happened, I can understand why he feels that way. But that would not protect him, the victories he's had, from the stigma of having overseen a massive American geopolitical defeat. And that might well bring him to his senses. I think it would. If we get, assuming this negative path becomes the initial path of his administration, which I'm not predicting.
We hope you're enjoying today's episode of Frontline. Don't forget, you can also now listen to Frontline in podcast form. Just search for The World in 10 from wherever you get your podcasts, where you can also hear daily analysis of the biggest stories relating to war and defence. And we'll put a link to The World in 10 in the description below.
Well, one thing that may determine where things go in the future is how the conflict in Ukraine is actually going on the ground. And I thought we could speak briefly about that now, because we understand Ukrainian troops are already in direct conflict with North Korean troops who have moved to support the Russian invasion. What's your assessment of the current state of play in regard to the conflict on the front line?
I think that the situation is more difficult now than it was a few weeks ago. And I think that Ukraine had a hard time starting late last year up through this spring, principally, but not only, because of the withholding of American aid. And that meant they had to be very careful with the ammunition and some of the weapon systems that they had. But then starting late spring, early summer, things began to improve along Ukraine's defensive lines in Donbass. And then they launched what has proved to be a quite successful incursion into the Kursk Oblast of Russia. And so I would say from the beginning of that until maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, things were moving back somewhat in Ukraine's direction. Not just because of what they were doing in Kursk, but because of the impact of that on the front lines. But Russia seems to have now parried, at least partly, the offensive into Kursk and have resumed momentum in Ukraine's east. But they've done that with exceptional casualties, which may or may not be sustainable. I say may or may not because the North Korean factor is a new one. And if this is just the beginning of a pipeline of troops, then even those massive casualties are sustainable for another year or so. So it's a more perilous moment right now. The Ukrainians, though, I believe, are well established in Kursk, despite the current Russian counteroffensive, which is creating some problems on Ukraine's flanks. They're well dug in south of the River Seine. And of course, Putin gave a deadline of October 1st for, quote unquote, liberating Kursk. It didn't happen. It's not going to happen this calendar year. I'm safe in projecting. And I believe the Ukrainian line will hold as long as Western assistance is not weakened. And again, we know that there's increasing pressure on Biden to let Ukraine use American ATACMS, the longer range American ATACMS, deeper into Russia. By the way, it's ridiculous that people describe those as deep strike weapons, because they go all of 180 miles, and Russia's 9,000 miles from east to west. Even if we gave Ukraine Tomahawks, which I believe we should give, with a range of 1,000 plus, that's not quite deep into Russia either, given how large Russia is. But that's somewhat deep into Russia. But the discussion of deep strike ATACMS is simply a sign of how ignorant our discourse is, driven in large part by the timidity of the Biden administration. They've made that connection because they're afraid of giving Ukraine those weapons because they've been intimidated by Russia's nuclear threats.
And the presence of North Korean troops in this conflict has led some to suggest, well, there is no argument rationally. I know it's sort of dangerous to use the word rational when you're talking about Vladimir Putin, but there's no rational argument as to why NATO troops shouldn't be fighting on behalf of Ukraine in this conflict. What possibility do you think that might be?
I hesitate to raise that subject, NATO troops getting involved. Although the logic you've just laid out is impeccable, because politics ain't logic, and politically that's just an extraordinarily controversial step, and not a necessary step. I don't have any doubt, zero doubt, that if American aid, the amount of American aid continues, but it's continued with far more advanced American weapons, including those Tomahawks, which actually are not advanced. It's 1980s technology like the ATACMS, but they fly farther and have a bigger payload. And we begin to send F-16s in quantity. We train the Ukrainian pilots promptly. Ukraine will begin to push the Russians back on the battlefield. I don't have any doubt about that. The problem is the timidity of the policy to date and the prospect of a far more disastrous American policy if the naive folks around Trump have their way. But assuming, again, if we get a Trump who understands the stakes the way I've laid them out and is not intimidated by the Russians the way Biden has been, things will turn up very nicely.
Zelensky, in the comments I referred to earlier, did present a victory plan to Western leaders, including to Donald Trump and to Joe Biden, a little while ago, which the Times' World Affairs editor Catherine Philp described as receiving a lukewarm response. Why do you think it did receive such a lukewarm response? And if that was the best Ukraine could come up with, why wasn't it backed more fully, do you think?
It received a lukewarm response because of the ultimate timidity of the West in this crisis. And that timidity comes principally from Washington, but enabled by Berlin, because Biden and Schultz have both been intimidated by Putin. His plan is sound because it requires Ukraine to regain a certain amount of initiative on the battlefield, which requires the United States and Germany and others to allow the ATACMS to strike into Russia, to send Tauruses and allow them to be used on Russian territory, and to consider even better weapon systems, even more able weapon systems. And we know that the White House does not want to go there. And that's because they have let Putin deter the United States from behaving like a superpower. And that's deeply unfortunate. The North Korean development is the third development since late last spring to which the United States and NATO have not responded. Moscow is chipping away at NATO's deterrence, one by this large sabotage campaign across Europe, and perhaps heading to the United States if that Wall Street Journal report about the Russians placing explosives on DHL planes, which were heading to the United States and Canada. The U.S. and NATO have not responded to this. Now, over the past 6 or 8 weeks, we've seen regular Russian intrusions into NATO airspace with missiles and drones heading to Ukraine. NATO's not defending its own airspace against Russian provocations, again, chipping away at NATO's deterrence. And now North Koreans, and there's been no response. The White House response is, well, we're not going to put additional restrictions on use of American weapons as a result of this. That's ridiculous. The real response should have been, of course, now we're going to reconsider, and yes, not say a word, but let the Ukrainians use the longer range ATACMS against North Koreans heading to the front in Russia and against other strategic targets in Russia. This is a perfect case of us to begin to have a bolder policy, one that our interests demand.
And so is that the scenario that a personality like Donald Trump could actually have a benefit?
If he decides that Putin's trying to take him for a patsy, for a weak man, that's what we'll see.
I thought I'm conscious that whilst being the former ambassador of the United States to Ukraine, you also served as the US Consul General in Jerusalem. So I thought, if we may, we could just briefly touch on the situation in the Middle East. Benjamin Netanyahu has already described Donald Trump's election victory as history's greatest comeback. So what his view is not up for debate. But how do you see the US-Israeli relationship evolving over the next few months, and indeed, how do you think that will affect the Middle East conflict?
I suspect that Trump will be clearly better than Biden on what's happening in the Middle East for several reasons. First, before answering your question directly, the timidity we've seen from the Biden team in Eastern Europe has been evident in the Middle East. At this point in time, I don't know, is it over 400 or over 500 attacks by Iranian proxies on U.S. soldiers and U.S. ships in the Middle East, with very limited American responses? We had well over 100 before 3 American soldiers were killed about a year ago. And the responses we made to the attacks before that were tiny. After that, we launched a decent response, but not strong enough given the fact that Americans died. Had we launched those stronger attacks before the Americans died, maybe they'd be alive. How many attacks have been launched at U.S. ships, protecting shipping in the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea with limited U.S. response? Point of fact, the United States should be striking back at Iran. So the Iranians pay a price for their proxies. I think we'll see something like that from Trump. And of course, Biden's been trying to hamstring the Israelis as they went after Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran. Now I understand why we'd want more nuance from Israel in the Gaza Strip, although we should have been clear from the beginning that civilian casualties in Gaza, the responsibility for them lie principally overwhelmingly with Hamas. But there's no reason for us to restrain the Israelis vis-a-vis Hezbollah, or even vis-a-vis Iran. I suspect Trump understands what I've just said. Again, he's an intuitive politician, he's not from reading history books. But I think he understands that. And that's what I would expect. But it is true that Israel has always come to rely on unquestioning bipartisan support in the United States. And that's gone with the growth of woke politics in the Democratic Party. Not so in the Republican Party.
It's been fascinating to get your thoughts on all of these issues. I actually can't stand it when journalists do this to their interviewees, but I can't resist the temptation. So apologies in advance. But in one word, could you answer the following question? In your mind, is the world a safer place today than it was yesterday as a result of Donald Trump's victory?
I can't do a one-word answer. If the smart guys around Trump are in charge of foreign policy, absolutely, positively. I do believe that Trump, in terms of the American economy, getting rid of a lot of foolish woke policies that the Biden administration put in place, will be better for the United States domestically. And hopefully, it will lead the Democrats to reconsider. So in the future, their policies will be more moderate. That would be a great thing for this country. If the Joe Biden, who was a candidate, becomes a ruler of the guy who's most influential in the Democratic Party, as opposed to Joe Biden, who simply took the woke agenda, we'd all be better off.
That is your answer, and I cannot do anything about it. Thank you very much indeed. It's been fascinating to speak to you. We very much appreciate your time, and it would be wonderful at some point in the future to discuss these things with you again.
Happy to continue.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Herbst.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.